A Tale of Two Cities. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. Paris. A very long time ago in Paris, a doctor called Alexandre Manette was released from prison. He had been locked up for 18 years. He was in prison not because he had done something wrong, but because he had stood up for what was right. In doing the right thing, Dr. Manette made enemies. Powerful enemies who threw him into prison. In those days, the rich and powerful ruled France. Ordinary people were kept poor and hungry. But anger and despair were bubbling beneath the surface. In a few years there would be a violent revolution. It would bring about the deaths of the King and Queen of France and many of the rich and powerful. Our story starts a few years before the revolution, just after Dr. Alexandre Manette was freed from prison. He had moved into a room above a tavern in a poor area of Paris. The owners of the tavern, Monsieur and Madame Defarge, were friends of his. Dr. Manette's mind was scarred by his experience in prison. The one good thing that had happened there was that he had taught himself how to make shoes. Now he clung to his workbench and tools as if they were the only things in the whole world that he could trust. One day, the door to his gloomy attic room opened. There stood Monsieur Defarge, a beautiful young woman and an older man. "You have visitors," said Monsieur Defarge. Dr. Manette did not look up from his workbench. "Here is a gentleman who knows a well-made shoe when he sees one," said Monsieur Defarge. "Show him the shoe you are working on." Manette, the older man, whose name was Jarvis Lorry, took the shoe in his hand. "Tell him what kind of shoe it is, and the maker's name," said Defarge. "It is a lady's shoe," said Dr. Manette softly, still not looking up. "And the maker's name?" 105, North Tower, said Dr. Manette. Mr. Lorry realized Dr. Manette was saying his old prison cell number instead of his name. 105, North Tower, the Dr. Manette repeated. "Do you recognize me, Dr. Manette?" said the young woman. Dr. Manette kept looking at his work. The woman moved towards him. Although her face was young and Dr. Manette's was old, anyone looking at them side by side would have thought that they looked alike. The shoemaker caught sight of the hem of her dress as she neared him. He looked up and stared at her. "Are you the jailer's daughter?" he asked vaguely. The young woman's name was Lucy. Her golden hair tumbled down her neck. The shoemaker reached up, took a curl in his hand and peered at it. Lucy laid her hand on his shoulder. Monsieur Defarge and Jarvis Lorry watched from the doorway. They hardly dared to breathe. The shoemaker took off a blackened string that hung round his neck. A scrap of folded rag was attached to it. He opened the rag carefully, on his knee. Inside were two long threads of golden hair. Dr. Manette reached for the woman's golden curls again. His eyes moved from them to the strands in his hand. "They're the same." "How can it be?" he asked in wonder. "She laid her head upon my shoulder that night when I was taken away. When I was brought to the North Tower, I found these few hairs upon my sleeve. I have kept them ever since to remind me." The shoemaker was too tearful to continue. Lucy wrapped her arms around him. "We have come to take you away from here," she said. Her voice was on the edge of tears, too. "We are going to England, to London." Lucy was Dr. Manette's daughter. He had last seen her when she was a little golden-haired child. Lucy's mother, who was English, had died soon after her husband's imprisonment. Then Lucy's guardian, Jarvis Lorry, had taken her to live in England. Lucy had not seen her father again until that very moment, in the attic room in Paris. Soon after, the three of them, father, daughter, and guardian, boarded the carriage that would take them out of Paris. They were waved off by Monsieur and Madame Defarge. When the travelers reached Calais on the French coast, they got on a boat to Dover. Dr. Manette took pity on Dr. Manette. Lucy was very grateful to him. He was kind to them and helped find them the most sheltered spot on the small ship. Lucy and her father were happy in London, and, day by day, he began to get better. Lucy sometimes thought of Charles Darnay, though she did not expect to see him again. London. The criminal court in London was known as the Old Bailey. It was full of people. They had come to watch the trial of a spy. Eager faces strained around pillars and corners for a glimpse of the person standing in the dock. He was a young and handsome man, about 25 years old. His name was Charles Darnay. It was the Frenchman who, 4 years ago, had been kind to Dr. Manette and Lucy on the boat. The trouble was that Charles Darnay was French. Britain and France were not at war, but the two countries were very suspicious of each other. And Darnay seemed to have been behaving oddly. Against their will, Dr. Manette and Lucy were called as witnesses against Charles Darnay. The lawyer, who was trying to prove Darnay was a French spy, asked his first question. "Miss Manette, have you seen the prisoner before?" "Yes, sir," said Lucy. "Where?" "On board the boat that brought my father and me to England. Aula did talk with the prisoner on you that journey across the channel?" "Yes, sir, tell us about it." Looking fondly at Charles Darnay standing in the dock, Lucy said, "When the gentleman came on board the boat." "The gentleman?" said the lawyer. "Do you mean the prisoner?" "Yes, sir." "Then say prisoner. When the prisoner came on board, he noticed that my father was very weak. The prisoner was kind and gentle to us." "Never mind all that," said the lawyer. "Did the prisoner tell you that he was traveling under a false name?" "He told me that he was traveling on secret business that might get people into trouble. That is why he did not use his real name." Seeing how bad her words made Darnay look, Lucy began to weep. "Monsieur Darnay is a good man, I am sure," she pleaded. "Never mind all that," replied the lawyer. The last thing the lawyer wanted was for Lucy's words to convince the jury that Charles Darnay was innocent. Then something odd happened. Another witness was called. He said that he had seen Darnay hanging around near a dockyard. He believed that the Frenchman could have been spying on the soldiers and sailors who worked there. The lawyer defending Darnay was called Mr. Stryver. Sitting next to him was an untidy man, who lounged casually on the bench. This man nudged Mr. Stryver and whispered in his ear. Mr. Stryver asked the witness, "Are you quite sure it was the prisoner you saw near the dockyard?" "Quite sure," said the witness. "Have you ever seen anybody who looks like the prisoner?" "I don't think so," said the witness. "Look carefully at this gentleman here," said Mr. Stryver, pointing to the man lounging next to him. "And now look carefully at the prisoner again. They look very like each other, don't they?" It was true, they did look very alike. Especially when the untidy man, whose name was Sidney Carton, took off his wig. Everyone in the courtroom gasped and nodded in agreement. People started to talk among themselves. Those two men might almost be twins. "They're doubles. That witness can't be trusted. And the nice young lady thinks the prisoner is innocent." "Quiet," the judge bellowed. The courtroom fell silent once more. The jury went away to consider its verdict. Was Charles Darnay guilty or not guilty of spying for France? After several anxious hours, the verdict came back, not guilty. Afterwards, Charles Darnay thanked Sidney Carton, the man who looked so much like him. "It was nothing," said Carton carelessly. "I don't know why I did it, anyway." Sidney Carton was altogether a careless young man. He was a friend of the lawyer, Mr. Stryver, and sometimes helped him in his work. But he had never cared much about other people or about himself. Now, however, Sidney Carton envied Charles Darnay for one thing. He had seen the way Lucy gazed fondly at the accused man in the dock. No one had ever looked at him in that way. Even so, he was glad that he had helped to save Darnay. The love between Charles Darnay and Lucy grew quickly. The Frenchman earned his living by teaching French to people in London. He often visited the house where Lucy lived with her father. Dr. Manette was pleased to see his daughter fall in love with the young Frenchman, whom he liked very much. In those days, men often asked fathers for permission to marry their daughters. When Darnay asked Dr. Manette, he agreed at once. On the morning of the wedding, Darnay wanted to speak to Dr. Manette in private. When the two men finally came out of the doctor's room, Dr. Manette's face had turned as white as his hair. What had passed between the father and the man about to become his son-in-law? What words had been spoken? No one knew, and the wedding went ahead as planned. As the couple left for their honeymoon, Dr. Manette and his daughter embraced. "Take care of her, Charles," said the doctor. More time passed. In London, Lucy and Charles Darnay lived happily with Dr. Manette. The couple had a daughter. She had long golden hair like her mother's. Sidney Carton was a frequent visitor to the house. He enjoyed their company and they enjoyed his. He was very fond of Lucy and of her little family. But, while things were calm in London, there was a violent storm brewing in Paris. Paris. One day, outside Monsieur and Madame Defarge's tavern, a cask of wine tumbled off the back of a cart. The cask cracked apart when it hit the ground. Red wine spilt across the muddy stones of the street. At once, all the people nearby stopped what they were doing and ran to the spot. Some tried to scoop up thin streams of wine in their cupped hands. Others tried to catch the precious red liquid in broken cups and bowls. Some even took pieces of wine-soaked wood from the shattered cask and chewed them. They were so thirsty, they would have licked the wine off the road itself. They looked like scarecrows. Their hands and their mouths and their ragged clothes were all stained red. The stains were from the wine, but they were the color of blood. As if this were a signal, the poor people of Paris seemed to come together like one vast creature. A creature with thousands of arms and legs. Steel blades and wooden sticks waved in the air. Voices filled the narrow, dirty streets with a sound like thunder. The hands of Madame Defarge were no longer occupied with knitting needles. Now she grasped an axe. Her belt held a pistol and a sharp knife. "Come, then," cried Monsieur Defarge. "Fellow citizens and friends, we are ready. To the Bastille!" The Bastille was the prison where Dr. Manette had been kept years before. It was not far from the Defarge's tavern. With its 8 great towers and battlements, the Bastille looked like a castle. The crowd surged around the massive stone walls. Soldiers joined them and brought cannons. Amid smoke and fire, the people stormed the gates of the fortress. The Defarges were at the head of the crowd. Once inside, the attackers spread across the courtyard into every corner of the prison. They were going to seize the guards and force them to release the prisoners. The poor people of Paris were full of fury. If they could, they would have torn apart the Bastille with their bare hands. But Monsieur Defarge was on a different mission. He grabbed a guard and said, 105, North Tower? It is a cell in this prison, yes? The terrified guard nodded. Show it to me. And bring a torch with you. Defarge and another man called Jacques followed the guard, who held a burning torch. He led them along stony passageways and up mill-rugged stairs. The noise of the raging crowd grew distant. After a while, the guard stopped at a low door. He put a key in the lock and swung the door open. As they all bent their heads to enter, he said, 105, North Tower. In the room was a stool, table, and straw bed. There was a barred window high in the wall. There was also an open hearth full of wood ash. The chimney had bars inside to prevent anybody climbing in or out that way. Pass that torch slowly along these walls, said Defarge to the guard. The man obeyed. Defarge followed the smoky light closely with his eyes. Stop, cried Defarge. Look here, Jacques. Read Jacques. Alexander Manette Defarge traced the letters scratched into the stone. Next to AM were the words a poor doctor. It's his cell, for sure, said Defarge, more to himself than to Jacques or the guard. He told the guard to hold the torch higher. Then he ducked into the hearth and peered up the chimney. Defarge had brought a crowbar with him. He scraped at the iron grating inside the chimney. Flakes of soot and tiny pieces of stone pattered onto his head, but he paid no attention. The other two men couldn't see what he was doing, but Defarge seemed to be reaching for something that was hidden inside the chimney. As he emerged, he tucked an item into his dusty, sooty shirt. What's that? Said Jacques. Nothing, said Defarge. Of course, it was not nothing. What Monsieur Defarge had recovered from inside the chimney was a true story, written by Dr. Manette in the dim light of his cell. It explained how he had come to be in prison, and who had put him there. Long ago, Dr. Manette had been summoned to attend to an injured young man. He was taken to a grand house. It belonged to the Marquis Saint-Evremond, a cruel man. This greedy man did as he pleased to the poor peasants who worked themselves to the bone for him. The injured young man was not part of Saint-Evremond's family. He was the brother of a beautiful peasant girl the Marquis had his eye on. When the girl's brother tried to stop the Marquis from taking her away, Evremond stabbed him. Dr. Manette did everything he could for the dying brother, but he could not save him. The doctor protested to the Marquis Saint-Evremond. But the Marquis told Dr. Manette that the young man's life mattered no more than the game birds he shot from the sky, or the deer he hunted for pleasure. The Marquis tried to bribe Dr. Manette. He offered him a huge pile of gold in exchange for his silence about the killing, but the doctor pushed the glittering coins back. Dr. Manette wrote a letter to the French government. He did not expect much to be done. Nobles like the Marquis were powerful and protected. He realized just how much when he was called to another urgent medical case. The Marquis and some other men were in the coach that came to collect him. The Marquis took the letter the doctor had written and burnt it in his lantern. The doctor was blindfolded and taken to the Bastille. There he stayed for many years, in a remote, secret cell, 105, North Tower. Dr. Manette had hoped that someday his written story would be discovered and that the Marquis would be punished for his crime. He ended his tale by cursing the Evremond family. London. The storm of the French Revolution was heard and felt across the Channel, in London. It was heard and felt by Charles Darnay. Darnay was the name that Charles had given himself. He was ashamed of his real name. He was ashamed of the family into which he had been born, the Saint Evremonds. The Marquis was his uncle, but Charles's father was just as bad. Despairing of his family and their cruel ways, Charles had escaped to England. He changed his name and resolved to live simply and honestly, and to earn his own money. He felt bound to tell Dr. Manette his real name on the morning of his marriage to Lucy. That was why the doctor had been so shaken that the color drained from his face. His beloved daughter's husband-to-be was the nephew of the man who had left him to rot away in the Bastille. But the doctor knew that Charles was a good man. He was completely different from the older members of his family. There was no reason for Charles to ever return to France, especially now that his father and his uncle were dead. The grand house outside Paris had been burnt to the ground. But the common people of France had risen up against their cruel rulers. They were not satisfied by a few great houses burning to the ground, or by a handful of rich nobles being beheaded with the guillotine. They wanted more. They were full of rage and revenge. They didn't care if they destroyed the innocent along with the guilty. There had been a steward called Gabelle on Charles's uncle's estate. Gabelle was a kind man, but because of his connection to the Evremonds he was threatened with death. He wrote to Charles for help. At great risk, Charles decided to return to Paris and defend the steward. He did not tell Lucy or Dr. Manette. He knew that they would prevent him from leaving. Instead, he wrote them each a letter, explaining his reasons. Then, one evening, he slipped away from the house in London and set off for Paris. Paris. Charles ran into trouble as soon as he arrived back in France. He was an aristocrat, one of the hated class of people, like his uncle and father. He was a Saint Evremond. Charles was dragged to Paris and thrown into a prison called La Force. There, traitors and aristocrats were put on trial. Often, they were sent to the guillotine to be beheaded. Charles was in danger because of his family name. Gabelle the steward was released, but Charles was imprisoned in his place. Lucy and Dr. Manette heard this frightening news and traveled to Paris. They were accompanied by Jarvis Lorry and Sidney Carton. Carton had been a student in Paris and knew the city well. The four of them were desperate to rescue Charles. Dr. Manette believed he may have some influence over the people. He had been a victim of the old system they were rebelling against. He had been punished for helping the poor. Surely Charles's accusers would listen to him? For the second time in his life, Charles was brought before a court. He was faced by several judges and prosecutors. The crowd in the courtroom cried out for his head to be chopped off. They said that he was an enemy of the state. But Charles answered the judges' accusations calmly. He said he was the son-in-law of Alexander Manette. The doctor then spoke on Charles's behalf. For a time, it seemed as though all would be well and Charles would be saved. But there was a surprise witness. Two surprise witnesses, in fact. Monsieur and Madame Defarge. Madame Defarge sat at the back on the courtroom. She knitted as if her knitting needles were daggers. She watched her husband produce the ragged sheets of paper he'd retrieved from the chimney of the doctor's prison cell. Dr. Manette's story was read out to the court. The death of the young man stabbed by the Marquis Saint Evremond was revealed. Then Madame Defarge gave witness. She declared that she was the sister of the dead man. She demanded that the Saint Evremond family be destroyed, just as her family had been destroyed long ago. Dr. Manette, too, in his prison cell, had cursed the Saint Evremonds. Without knowing it, he had signed a death warrant for his own son-in-law. Worse still, the Defarges were so set on vengeance that they began to plot against Lucy, too. After all, she was a Saint Evremond by marriage. Charles spent his last night in his cell in La Force. Again, he wrote to his wife and to his father-in-law. He asked Dr. Manette to care for Lucy and their young daughter. He tried to distract himself from what was to come with visions of their life back in London. He heard a clock outside striking the hours. 9, 10, 11. It was the final time he would hear those hours. There were footsteps in the stone passage outside the door. The key turned in the lock. The door quickly opened and closed. There before him stood Sidney Carton. Sidney put his finger to his lips. The guards are outside. I have bribed both of them. What are you doing here? Said Charles. Hurry, said Sidney. We have little time. Swap boots with me. Swap your scarf and coat for mine. Quick! Sidney, there is no escaping from this place. You will die with me. It is madness. It would be madness if I asked you to escape. But you are escaping as me. Charles was confused. But what are you going to do? I shall stay here. Listen, Charles, Jarvis Lorry is waiting in a carriage outside. You'll be reunited with Lucy and Dr. Manette. Using my name, you can all escape back to England? Charles was tempted for a moment. The promise of freedom, of seeing his wife and daughter again. Yet he said, I cannot allow you men to do this. You are no more guilty than I am. I have no wife or child, said Life Sidney. And I have never valued my own life very much. When Charles was sentenced, Sidney had decided to save him even if it meant dying in his place. Just as he had helped Charles in the Old Bailey by showing how similar they looked, Sidney would act as Charles's double now. He knew that Charles would not escape willingly, so Sidney cleverly distracted him. Then he pressed a handkerchief over his mouth and nose. The handkerchief was soaked in a liquid that would make Charles suddenly fall asleep. While Charles slept, Sidney quickly swapped clothes with him. Then he knocked on the cell door. When the guards entered, Sidney spoke and acted exactly like Charles. My friend has been overcome by distress at seeing me here, he said. Take him to the main gate. A carriage is waiting. The guards carried Charles out, believing him to be Sidney Carton. The plan worked. Charles was placed in the carriage with Jarvis Lorry, Lucy and her father. Every time they passed a checkpoint, they feared being discovered and arrested. But the red-capped soldiers and citizens accepted the identity papers naming the fourth occupant of the carriage as Sidney Carton, a lawyer from London. When they reached the coast, they boarded a little boat to England. They were finally safe. But from that day on, they never forgot the name of their protector and savior. When Lucy had another child, a boy, they named him Sidney in Sidney Carton's honor. And what happened to Sidney Carton? A few hours after he had helped Charles escape his cell in La Force, he was taken to be killed. The crowd gathered round the guillotine. They were impressed by how peaceful and calm Sidney seemed. As reviewed his life in his last moments, Sidney had no regrets. He thought, it is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known.